I am excited to be here with you today. Before I get started, I'm going to invite you to pull out your cell phones. I want to have an opportunity to connect with you and engage. I have my social media handles listed here. So if you are on the platform, formerly known as Twitter or Instagram, let's connect and engage. This session this afternoon is going to be full of information designed to help you improve your way of navigating and participating in difficult discussions by taking charge of your emotions. Please feel free to share notable points on your social media platform, take pictures and post them. Don't forget to use the hashtag Georgia Council. These crazy drivers make me so mad. By show of hands, how many of you have said that or heard someone else say that? True story. True story. While I was driving one day, I was on a call with a cousin of mine. Now, I'm an only child, so my cousins are my siblings. I was on a call with a cousin of mine, and while we were catching up on each other's lives, I could hear a loud horn blaring outside of her car. I asked her, "What's going on? Who is the arrogant jerk?" I was upset. The obnoxious sound of the horn had led me to think this person was being rude. Without skipping a beat, my cousin responded. She said, "Girl, who knows? They probably need to use the restroom badly." My cousin had a different narrative. My narrative was probably going down the path of road rage, but her narrative allowed for empathy. It made room for the possibility that the driver's behavior was due to situational factors rather than attributing it to the driver's character or personality. This conversation with my cousin and I creates space for the provocative question today. Do people push your buttons, or do you? One thing's for sure, no matter who is pushing the buttons, some people react more explosively than others, even to the same stimulus. Why is that? Emotions don't just happen. They don't settle upon you like a fog. They're not imposed on you by others. No matter how comfortable it might make you feel saying it, other people don't make you mad. You make you mad. You make you scared. You make you annoyed. You make you feel insulted. You and only you create your emotions. Once you've created your upset emotions, you have only two options. You can act on them or be acted on by them. That is, when it comes to strong feelings, you either find a way to navigate them or get lost in them. Here's a story that illustrates how this all unfolds. Marsha. Marsha is currently being held captive to some strong emotions. Let me tell you what happened. Marsha and her colleague Lester just reviewed the latest draft of a project with their director. During the meeting, they were supposed to be presenting their ideas together. But when Marsha paused to take a breath, Lester took over the presentation, making almost all of the points they had both come up with. When their director turned to Marsha for input, there was nothing left for her to say. Lester had covered everything. Marsha also found out prior to the meeting, Lester took their combined suggestions to their director and discussed them without Marsha present. Since then, Marsha has been feeling frustrated and angry. So now Marsha believes that Lester is downplaying her contribution because she's a woman. She's getting really fed up with his toxic masculinity. She doesn't want to appear easily offended, so she usually says nothing and just does her job. However, she does assert herself by occasionally getting in some sarcastic zingers about how she's being treated. Sure, I can get that printout for you. Would you like me to get your coffee while I'm at it? Marcia mutters and rolls her eyes as she leaves the nurse's station. Lester, in turn, finds Marcia's wisecracks and cynicism confusing. He's not sure what has Marcia upset, but he's beginning to despise her attitude and hostile reaction to everything he does. As a result, when the two of them are on shift together, you could cut the tension with a knife. The people who are really bad at dialogue fall into the same trap as Marcia. She is entirely unaware of the precarious assumption she's making. Marcia is upset at being overlooked, and she's keeping a professional silence. She's assuming her emotions and behavior are the only right and reasonable reactions under the circumstances. She's convinced that anyone under the same circumstances would feel the same way. Here's the problem. Marcia is treating her feelings as if they are the only valid response. Since in her mind they are both justified and accurate, she makes no effort to change or even question them. Besides, in her view, Lester caused them. Ultimately, her actions, saying nothing and taking jabs, are being driven by these very emotions. Since she's not acting on her emotions are acting on her, controlling her behavior and fueling her deteriorating relationship with Lester. When you're not good at dialogue, you fall hostage to your emotions and you don't even realize it. The people who are okay at dialogue, they realize that if they don't control their emotions, matters will only get worse. So they try something else. They fake it. They shove down their reactions and they do their best to return to dialogue. Unfortunately, once these emotionally choked folks hit a rough spot in a difficult discussion, their suppressed emotions come out of hiding. They show up as clenched teeth or cynical comments, or maybe their paralyzing fear causes them to avoid saying what they really think. In any case, their emotions eventually sneak out of that cubbyhole that they have been crammed into, and they find a way to creep into the conversation. Dialogue, it takes a nosedive. It's never pretty, and it typically destroys the conversation. The people who excel in dialogue, they do something completely different. They aren't held prisoner by their emotions, nor do they hide their emotions or suppress them. Instead, they act on them. When they have strong feelings, they influence and often change their emotions by thinking them out. As a result, they choose the emotions they want to have. And by doing so, it makes it possible to choose behaviors that lead to better outcomes. This, of course, is easier said than done. It's not easy to rethink yourself from an emotionally charged state into one that puts you back in control. But it can be done. Matter of fact, it should be done. So where should Marcia start? She's feeling betrayed, but is worried that if she says something to Lester, she'll look too sensitive. So she alternates between holding her feelings inside, avoiding, and being sarcastic, masking. Marcia's actions clearly stem from her feelings. But what's causing Marcia's feelings to begin with? To help rethink or gain control of our emotions, let's take a look at where our feelings come from in the first place. In this scenario, is it Lester's behavior? Did Lester make Marcia feel insulted and hurt? Marcia heard and saw Lester do something. She generated an emotion, and then she acted out her feelings using masking and avoiding as her response. What happens between Lester's acting and Marcia's feelings? How do our feelings drive actions? It turns out there's an intermediate step, a bridge between what others do and how we feel. What is this go-between step? Just after we observe what others do, and just before we feel some emotion about it, we tell ourselves a narrative. We add meaning to the action we observe. We make a guess at the intentions driving the behavior. Why were they doing that? We also add judgment. Is that good or bad? And then, based on these thoughts or narratives, our body responds with an emotion. This model is our path to action. It explains how emotions, thoughts, and experiences lead to our actions. We observe, we tell a narrative, and then we feel. Since we, and only we, are telling ourselves the narrative, we can take back control of our own emotions by telling a different narrative. We now have a point of leverage or power. If we can find a way to control the narratives we tell by rethinking or retelling them, we can navigate our emotions and therefore navigate how we act in our difficult discussions. The narratives we tell ourselves provide our rationale for what's happening. They're our interpretations of the facts. They help explain what we see and hear. They're theories we use to attribute what, why, and how. For instance, Marcia asks, why does Lester take over? He doesn't trust my ability to communicate? He thinks I can't be compelling because I'm a woman. Our narratives also help explain, how am I supposed to judge all of this? Is this a good or a bad thing? Lester thinks I'm incompetent, and that's a problem. A narrative might also include, what should I do about this? If I say something, he'll think I'm a whiner or oversensitive. So it's probably best to not talk about it. Of course, as we come up with our own meaning or narrative, it isn't long until our body responds with strong feelings or emotions. After all, our emotions are directly linked to our judgments of right or wrong, good or bad, fair or unfair, kind or selfish. Marcia's narrative generates anger and frustration. These feelings in turn drive Marcia to her actions, toggling back and forth between clamming up and being mean towards Lester. Even if you don't realize it, you are telling yourselves narratives. When I help people understand that our narratives drive our emotions and not other people's actions, I'm often met with a mix of side-eye and a sprinkle of disbelief. The narratives we tell ourselves happen incredibly fast. We tell ourselves narratives about situations so quickly that we don't even realize we're doing it. If you don't believe this is true, ask yourself this. Do you always become angry when someone laughs at you? If sometimes you do and sometimes you don't, then your response isn't hardwired. That means something goes on between others laughing and you feeling. That's when the narrative we tell starts. You may not remember when it happened, but it did. Any set of facts can be used to tell an infinite number of narratives. Write that one down. That's a pearl. Any set of facts can be used to tell an infinite number of narratives. Marcia could also have decided that Lester didn't realize she cared so much. She could have concluded that Lester was feeling unimportant and this was his way of showing he was valuable. Or maybe he had been burned in the past because he hadn't personally seen through every detail of a project. Any of these other narratives would have fit the facts and would have created very different emotions. If we take control of our narratives, they won't control us. People who excel at dialogue are able to influence their emotions during difficult discussions. They first recognize that we are definitely in control of the narratives we tell. After all, we do make them up all on our own. But they also acknowledge that once they're told the narratives, they control us. They first control how we tell, how we feel, and then they control how we act. And as a result, they drive the outcomes we get from the more complex conversations. But it doesn't have to be this way. We can explore different narratives and break the cycle of poor dialogue. In fact, we must consider different narratives to break the cycle of poor dialogue. If you want improved outcomes from your challenging discussions, change the narratives you tell yourself, even while you're in the midst of a disagreement. At this point, you might be thinking, okay, Keisha-Marie, what's the most effective way to navigate our narratives? The best at dialogue find a way to slow down and take charge of their path to action. To slow down the lightning quick storytelling process and the subsequent adrenaline flow, retrace your path to action one step at a time. First, you have to stop what you're currently doing, and then you have to get in touch with how you're feeling. Here's how you retrace your path. Notice your behavior. Ask yourself, am I in some form of fight or flight? Get in touch with your feelings. What emotions are encouraging me to act this way? Next, analyze your narratives. What story is creating these emotions? And then get back to the facts. What evidence do I have to support this narrative? By retracing your path one step at a time, you put yourself in a position to think about, question, and change any one or more of the steps. Why would you stop and retrace your path to action in the first place? If you tell yourself a narrative that your aggressive or passive-aggressive behavior is a necessary tactic, you won't see the need to reconsider your actions. If you immediately jump in with, they started it, or otherwise find yourself rationalizing your behavior, you're not going to feel compelled to change. Rather than stop and review what you're doing, you'll devote your time justifying your actions to yourself and others. When an unhelpful narrative is driving you to fight or flight, stop and consider how others would see your actions. Not only do those who are best at dialogue notice when they're slipping into fight or flight, but they can also admit it. They recognize the problem and begin to take corrective action. When they realize they're butchering dialogue, they review their own path to action. As skilled individuals begin to retrace their own path to action, they immediately move from examining their unhealthy behavior to exploring their feelings or emotions. It may seem easy, but identifying your emotions is more demanding than you might suspect. In fact, many people are emotionally uneducated. When asked to describe their feelings, they generally use limited words like mad or angry, which would be okay if these were accurate descriptors, but often they're not. Individuals will say they're angry when in fact they're feeling a mix of embarrassment and surprise. Or they suggest they're unhappy when they're feeling violated. Perhaps they express they're upset when they're actually feeling humiliated and cheated. Since life doesn't consist of a series of vocabulary tests, you could probably wonder, what difference do words make? Are we splitting hairs? But words matter. Knowing your specific feelings helps you take a more accurate look at what is happening and why. For instance, you're far more likely to take an honest look at the narrative you're telling yourself if you admit you're feeling embarrassed and off-put rather than simply angry. It's critical to get in touch with your feelings, and to do so, you may want to expand your emotional vocabulary. Question your feelings and narratives. Once you've identified your feelings, you should stop and ask, given the circumstances, is this the right feeling? Meaning, are you telling the correct narrative? Because where do our feelings come from? Our narratives. And narratives are our own inventions. The first step to regaining emotional control is to challenge the illusion that what you're feeling is the only right emotion under the circumstances. This may be the most challenging step, but also the most important one. By questioning our feelings, we open up ourselves to examine our narratives. We challenge the comfortable conclusion that our story, the narrative we told ourselves, is correct and true. What were the facts in Marsha's story? She saw Lester give the whole presentation, and she heard their director talk about meeting with Lester to discuss the project when she wasn't present. That's it. That was the beginning of Marsha's path to action. Don't confuse narratives with facts. That might be another good one to write down. Don't confuse narratives with facts. Sometimes we fail to question our narratives because we see them as undeniable facts. Oh, and by the way, the longer that you keep telling yourself this narrative and to others, the more ingrained it becomes. Because we generate narratives in the blink of an eye, we can get so caught up in the moment that we begin to believe our narratives are facts. They feel like facts. We conflate subjective conclusions with ironclad data. In trying to discern the facts from her narrative, Marsha might say, he's a chauvinist. That's a fact. Just look at how he treats me. He's a chauvinist. It's not a fact. It's the narrative that Marsha created to give meaning to the facts. The facts could mean just about anything. Others could watch Marsha's interaction with Lester and walk away with different narratives. Separate the facts from your narrative by focusing on behavior. To separate fact from narrative, get back to the genuine source of your feelings. Test your ideas against a simple criterion. Can you see or hear what you call a fact? Was it an actual behavior? For example, it's a fact that Lester gave 95% of the presentation and answered all but one question. This is specific, objective, and verifiable. Any two people watching that meeting would make the same observation. However, Marsha's narrative, he doesn't trust me, that's a conclusion. It explains what she thinks, not what Lester did. Conclusions are subjective. To avoid confusing our narratives with facts, watch for the use of provocative terms. For example, when assessing the facts, you might say, she looked at me funny. Phrases like looked at me funny can be inciting. They express judgments and attributions that in turn can create strong emotions. They're narratives, not facts. Notice how much different it is when you say, her eyes squinted and then her lips tightened, as opposed to, she looked at me funny. In Marsha's case, she implied that Lester was controlling and didn't respect her. Had she focused on his behavior, he talked a lot and met with their director one-on-one. This less volatile description would have allowed for several interpretations. Perhaps Lester was nervous, concerned, or unsure of himself. Either our narratives are entirely accurate and propel us in healthy conversations, or they're inaccurate but justify our behavior during difficult discussions. It's the second kind of narrative that routinely gets us into trouble. We go into fight or flight and devise reasonable reasons for it to be acceptable. When we feel the need to justify our ineffective behavior or disconnect ourselves from our poor results, we tend to tell ourselves narratives in three very predictable ways: victim narratives, villain narratives, and helpless narratives. Watch out for these three crafty narratives. As we piece together why people are doing what they're doing, or equally important, why we're doing what we're doing, we come up with explanations we think serve us well. Explanations like, of course I had an attitude. She's not slick. She deserved it. We call these imaginative and self-serving fabrications crafty narratives because they allow us to feel good about behaving poorly, particularly while we're achieving abysmal results. The first of the three crafty narratives is a victim narrative. Victim narratives, as you might have guessed, make us out to be innocent of any wrongdoings. The theme is always the same. The other person is the problem. They're wrong or illogical, and we are right and rational. In most challenging communication, when you tell a victim story, you intentionally ignore your role that you've played in the problem. You tell your story in a way that judiciously avoids whatever you have done or neglected to do that might have contributed to the problem. Let's say your leader took you off a big project last week and it hurt your feelings. You complained to anyone who would listen about how disappointed you were, but you failed to let your leader know that you were behind on this essential project, putting them in a difficult position, which is why they removed you in the first place. You leave out this part of the story because you prioritized your disappointment. To help support your victim narratives in these scenarios, you speak of nothing but your noble motives. It took a little longer because I was trying to obtain evidence-based data. In these scenarios, we tend to tell ourselves we're being punished for our noble intentions, not our lack of performance. With villain narratives, we create these nasty little tales by turning normal, decent human beings into villains. We assign negative intentions, and then we tell everyone about the evils of the other party as if somehow we're resolving some sort of injustice. In this instance, we might describe a leader who is zealous about quality as a control freak. In victim narratives, we exaggerate our own innocence. In villain narratives, we overemphasize the other person's guilt. We automatically assume the worst possible reasons for their behavior or grossest incompetence, while ignoring any possible good intentions or professional skills a person may have. Villain narratives help us blame others for inadequate outcomes and set us up to behave however we want. Then, when we fail to get the outcome from the dialogue we really want, we stay stuck in our ineffective behavior because we're convinced we're basically dealing with Cersei Lannister. Any Game of Thrones fans? Yeah. Okay. Maybe Cruella de Vil? When you pay attention to victim and villain narratives and catch them for exactly what they are, unfair caricatures, you start to see the terrible double standard we use when our emotions are out of control. When we make mistakes, we tell a victim story by claiming our intentions were innocent and pure. On the other hand, when others do things that hurt or inconvenience us, we tell villain narratives in which we invent terrible motives or exaggerate the flaws of others based on how their actions affected us. And finally, here come the helpless narratives. While villain and victim narratives look back to explain why we're in the situation we're in, helpless narratives look forward to explain why we can't do anything to change our situation. In these fabrications, we make ourselves out to be powerless to do anything healthy or helpful. We assure ourselves that there are no beneficial alternatives for dealing with our predicament, which justifies the actions we're about to take. It's particularly easy to act helpless when we turn others' behavior into fixed and unchangeable traits. When we choose to see our colleague as a control freak, which is a villain narrative, we're less inclined to give them feedback because do control freaks accept feedback? That's a helpless narrative. Helpless narratives often stem from villain narratives and typically offer us limited choices. We can either be honest and ruin the relationship or stay silent and suffer. Why do we even tell these crafty narratives to begin with? When we consciously go against our own sense of what's right, we can choose to either own up to it or justify it. And if we don't admit to our errors, we inevitably look for ways to justify them. That's why we tell these crafty narratives to begin with. They're forms of justification for our poor behavior that impede on us getting the outcomes we would prefer. With that in mind, let's focus on what we really want. Let's look at the final navigating my narratives skill. Tell the rest of the story. The dialogue smart recognize when they're telling crafty narratives, stop and then do what it takes to tell a useful narrative. A useful narrative, by definition, creates emotions that lead to healthy action, such as dialogue. And what transforms a crafty narrative into a useful one? The rest of the narrative. Disclose the missing details. Crafty narratives have one characteristic in common. They're incomplete. Crafty narratives omit critical information about us, about others, and about our options. Crafty narratives can be transformed into viable ones by including these. What's the best way to fill in the missing details? It's done by turning victims into actors, villains into humans, and the helpless into the able. Shift your narrative by turning victims into actors. Once you realize you're talking about yourself as an innocent victim, ask yourself, am I pretending not to notice my role in the problem? This question shakes you into facing the fact that maybe, just maybe, you did something to help cause the issue. Instead of being a victim, you were an actor. You played a role in the problem. This doesn't necessarily mean you had malicious motives or intentions. Perhaps your contribution was merely a thoughtless omission. Nonetheless, you contributed. Here's another example. A coworker constantly leaves you with labor-intensive, unpleasant tasks to complete. You frequently complain to friends and loved ones about being exploited. The parts you leave out of this story are that you smile broadly when your manager compliments you for your willingness to take on challenging tasks, and you've never said anything to your coworker about it. The first step in telling the rest of the story is to add these important facts back to your account. By asking what role you played, you realize how selective your perception has been. You become aware of how you've minimized your own mistakes while you've exaggerated the role of others. Turn villains into humans. When you find yourself labeling or vilifying others, stop and ask, why would a reasonable, rational, decent person do what this person is doing? This particular question humanizes others. As we explore plausible responses, our emotions soften. Empathy often replaces judgment, and personal accountability replaces self-justification. For instance, when I heard that loud horn on the other end of the call with my cousin, there was no further explanation other than they were being a jerk. Well, that's the narrative I told myself. But remember how my cousin responded? She saw the other driver as reasonable, rational, and decent. What if they really did need to use the restroom? Or what if there was a family emergency? Our purpose for asking why a reasonable, rational, and decent person might act a certain way is not to excuse others for their wrongdoings. If they are in fact guilty, we'll have time to deal with that later. The purpose of the humanizing question is to deal with our own narratives and our own emotions. It provides us with another tool for working on ourselves by providing a variety of possible reasons for the other person's behavior. In fact, with experience and maturity, we learn to worry less about others' intent and more about the effect others' actions are having on us. And here's the good news. When we reflect on alternative explanations, not only do we soften our emotions, but equally important, we relax our absolute certainty long enough to allow for dialogue, the only reliable way of discovering others' genuine intentions. Turn the helpless into the able. When you catch yourself complaining about your own helplessness, you can tell the complete story by returning to your original intentions. Ask yourself, what do I really want? For me, for others, for this relationship? Then stop thinking you have limited options, making you feel helpless to choose anything other than fight or flight. You can do this by asking, what would I do right now if I really want a better outcome? To see how this all fits together, let's circle back to Marcia. Let's assume she's retraced her path to action and she has separated the facts from her story. So she asked herself, am I pretending not to notice my role in the problem? When I found out that Lester was holding project meetings without me, I felt I should ask him why I wasn't included. If I did, I could open a dialogue to help us work better together. But then I didn't, and as a result, my resentment grew, and I was even less interested in broaching the subject. Why would a reasonable, rational, decent person do what Lester is doing. He really cares about producing quality work. Maybe he doesn't realize that I'm just as committed to the project's success as he is. What do I really want? I want a respectful, professional relationship with Lester, and I want recognition for the work I do. What would I do right now if I really want a better outcome? I should schedule some time with Lester and discuss how we work together. As we tell the rest of the story, we free ourselves from the harmful effects of unhealthy emotions. Best of all, as we regain control and move back to dialogue, we become rulers of our own feelings rather than prisoners. So what do you think Marcia did? She scheduled that meeting with Lester. As she prepared for the meeting, she refused to perpetuate her incomplete narratives. She admitted her role in the problem and entered the conversation with an open mind. Perhaps Lester wasn't trying to make her appear incompetent. When Marcia sat down with Lester, she found a way to tentatively share what she had observed. Not only did Marcia navigate her narrative, but she knew how to talk about it as a narrative. While engaging in healthy dialogue, Lester apologized for not including her in meetings with their director. He explained that he was trying to give their director a heads up on some controversial parts of the project, and realized in retrospect that he shouldn't have done this without Marcia present. He also apologized for dominating during the presentation. Marcia learned from the conversation that Lester talks more when he gets nervous. He suggested that they each be responsible for either the first or the second half of the presentation and stick to their assignments, so he'd be less likely to overtalk her. The discussion ended with both of them having an understanding of the other person's perspective, and Lester promising to be more self-aware. So again, I'll ask you, do people push your buttons or do you? It's such a victory to be back in charge of how we choose to feel, and it's absolutely easier said than done. Start by noticing your behavior. See yourself as a third-party observer. If you find yourself moving away from the conversation, remember to ask yourself, am I behaving in some form of fight or flight? Get in touch with your feelings. Learn to accurately identify the emotions behind your narrative. What emotions are encouraging me to act this way? Analyze your narratives and check them. Your narratives belong to only you. Question your conclusions and look for other possible explanations behind your story. What narrative is creating these emotions? Get back to the facts. Abandon your absolute certainty by distinguishing between hard facts and your invented story. What evidence do I have to support this narrative? Tell the rest of the story. Ask yourself these 4 questions. Am I pretending not to notice my role in the problem? Why would a reasonable, rational, and decent person do this? What do I really want? And what would I do right now if I really want a better outcome? Do you have a Lester in your life? The emphasis here is on self-awareness, accountability, recognizing our biases, and reframing narratives to facilitate constructive communication and healthier relationships. The power is in our use of introspection and empathy in resolving our conflicts and achieving positive outcomes in our difficult discussions. My dad always reminds me, Keisha, the secret is in the pause. If intense emotions keep you stuck in fight or flight, navigate your narratives by taking a breath and then pausing to retrace your path. Oh, and remember the horn honker? I hope in addition to having better difficult dialogue, you'll commute a little differently moving forward too. Thank you.